Welcome back, everyone. I am really happy to be talking to Keith Long today. Keith is something of an enigma. He is a minister, an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and he is also a deep skeptic, someone who has been writing and even preaching honestly about his doubts and questions. We're here to talk to him today about his book, which is called Doubting Faithfully: Confessions of a Skeptical Pastor. He has wrestled with his faith, his doubt, and has been really open and transparent about sharing both with his congregation and with people who wouldn't ordinarily darken the doors of a church. So, really happy to have you here today, Keith.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, of course. Let's get right into it, Keith. You open your book with a literal leap, a six-story plunge off a decommissioned bridge. And later, you compare this to your spiritual free fall as a pastor losing theological certainty. What gave you the courage to jump, not just into that river, but also into the public vulnerability as a still serving pastor?
Yeah, I jumped when I was in college because you're 20 years old and why not? It was something that was at the end of a whitewater rafting trip and we were all like, oh, now we jump off this 60-foot bridge. So that was the first and only bridge I've ever jumped off of. And it was a blast and it took my breath away and huge adrenaline rush. And that's just kind of the sort of things that I did and still kind of like to do as a risk taker, adrenaline junkie at heart. I think that kind of fueled my desire to see what would happen if I decided to be radically honest as a pastor, especially when I was going through that deep dark night of the soul and wrestling with some serious questions theologically. I'd kept, hearing of these retired pastors or active pastors who quit. And then, these tell-all accounts would come out, or, Mother Teresa had just died. And then, of course, all those letters that she had written, those came out, but, she was already dead. So, like, I kind of just got tired of, hearing about those after the fact stories and thought that the church needed a voice of someone who was living it, but also wrestling, with it. So I kind of doubled down on God's grace and felt like, these religious doctrines weren't binding, that, if there's a God, why would that God go by what humans had decided was in or out? And so I kind of just was like, this grace is bigger than what we think.
Mm.
So why not just, again, take a gamble on being honest and vulnerable? Because in my personal life, whenever I've been honest and vulnerable to others, like it always led to like deeper conversation and connection. So I was like, why wouldn't I want to do that as a pastor?
Hmm. It's so interesting the role that the pastorate has evolved into, where, at least at the height of modernity, it's like the answer man. It's the person, with answers, who typically was a man. And, the more sort of stoic you could be, the better. But really, as you say, diving deep into divine grace and vulnerability, it's inspiring. And, you say that doubt became a tether, like a kind of trust training. That language to me evokes a spiritual practice. In what ways has doubt actually deepened your devotion? And how do you tell the difference between doubt as an invitation versus doubt as avoidance or distraction?
Yeah, so I would say doubt has deepened my devotion in the sense that like I became very thoughtful about spirituality and about beliefs where like I wasn't gonna let anything be grandfathered in anymore, like nothing got a pass just because. It became just everything was an opportunity to look at it and say, what is this? Is this something that is worth believing? Does it need changing? How does this affect me? And so on down the line. So it became kind of like this ally and catalyst to doubt, to be empowered to hold it under the microscope, to put it in an interrogation chair and just see what came out of that kind of closer scrutiny rather than just, oh, well, that's just what the church believes. So I'd say that really led to more of a robust spiritual practice as a minister, as a person of faith, where again, I held everything sacredly, but also not with this like closed grip, but with like an open grip, I guess. And then like I talk about in the book, the tether I'm referring to is just like on a ropes course. You climb up 30 feet and there's all these different obstacles and you've got a harness on, and this tether goes up to this cable above you. And when I worked there in my 20s, we were in charge of helping people get through the course, but we also had a chance to do the course ourselves. I just remember being afraid of falling from that height, even though I was tethered. I separate into two types of doubt. There's invitation doubt, where I'm going to fall off this component here because I want to see what happens and grow from that. So I think doubt as an invitation is more about personal growth and self-awareness versus the other kind of doubt, which is that avoidant, distracting, angry kind of doubt. And that's more coming from a place of like self-preservation, where I need to feel safe. And this belief or whatever isn't making me feel safe for whatever reason. I've been hurt or disappointed. And so like that challenge course, it's kind of like, this is about self-awareness and growth. And so I'm going to fall and I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to test, am I doing this? Am I afraid because I'm going to get hurt or because I'm going to be humiliated in front of people? And then looking at it from that, well, what does that say about me? If I'm more afraid of being humiliated than dying. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I unravel the practice of doubt, if you will, as invitation, as self-awareness, or do I need distance? Do I need space from this for a while? And so that's how it plays out.
Got it. It sounds like for you, both of those have their place, but you're really wanting to discern like where that doubt is coming from and what it might be pointing to.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, what I appreciate about your book is that you do ask hard questions, you're very transparent about your skepticism, but it doesn't you don't strike me as, like, very cynical. Like, there's a sincerity to your search, and, you ask these hard questions, like whether the resurrection ever literally happened, but you don't reject the spiritual potency of the story, of the underlying motif, of the symbol. So how do you hold the tension between mythos and logos, especially in a church setting that has often demanded these either or kind of answers?
Well, it's not easy. It's a very difficult spot to be. I learned that pretty quickly into the journey with, especially, when I was having more atheistic thoughts, agnostic thoughts, wanting to be genuine and not hypocritical. And so it takes careful attention in articulation of things. I kind of treated it like if someone were to do this tell-all documentary revealing, the hypocrisy in the church, like, would they have anything on me? And so I was really careful to if I preached it, I meant it, and to not again just throw these blanket statements out that we often hear if I wasn't currently believing that or wrestling with that. So I would hold the tension by just being, again, really mindful about how I carried myself, what I said, what I didn't say. But then that lack of cynicism, I think, comes from just an overall still joy of these stories, and that, yeah, it's okay, like, to have that distance for a time. But, ultimately I started to see the scriptures as like a screenplay, like an ancient screenplay. And I have a filmmaking background in my undergraduate, and just something I've always done, making movies with friends and whatnot. And so I started to see, this playing out like, well, what if this just didn't happen, but it's still a great story, and great stories are worth engaging. And so that's kind of how I started to hold that tension and to kind of, again, resist attacking biblical literalism. I think there's a lot of people in our churches that need to feel safe in that literalism. And while that's not my jam, I wasn't about to take away something that they needed. I see literalism as closing your eyes and putting your fingers in your ears because the Bible says so. And to me, that closes the conversation. And I'm about opening the conversation and admitting that I don't know something has proved to be something that really levels the playing field that says, hey, we're kind of all on the same level here. Now let's open this up and wrestle with it.
Something in my own journey out of, religious fundamentalism that has been helpful for me is for the last decade or so engaging in the ideas of this somewhat obscure, like early 20th century esoteric teacher named G.I. Gurdjieff, who encouraged every seeker to verify spiritual ideas for ourselves and to not, as you said, take anything on secondhand faith or grandfather anything in. And one of the many elements of this path, which he calls the fourth way, is that friction in life and struggle and conflict is a feature and not a bug. Like it's actually something to be actively welcomed. When something is stepping on my corns, as Gurdjieff would say, like it's an invitation for me to go deeper into it rather than to shut it out as though some kind of uninterrupted tranquility is going to get me further down the road. And as I interact with your book, in this sort of fourth way sense, your story feels like a call to wakefulness through that friction of doubt. Were there any moments in your story that you would name as shocks to your system, events or encounters that cracked open your perception of God or reality?
Oh, definitely. The one that came to mind first would be unexplained infertility that I was told about, had no idea about until my wife and I had tried starting a family for a year and nothing was happening, and went in to be tested and still didn't have any thoughts that it would be me, and nothing ever traumatic happened. And then was told, I had this lack of a chromosome and had this unexplained infertility, and it just totally broke me apart, and yeah, shock to the system like no other. And this world that I lived in was cause and effect, and that house of cards just fell apart. And it was like, well, now nothing can be counted on. And so it just led into this just what the hell is going on? And some just real deep reflections on that and on myself. And again, like it was extremely disappointing. I mean, I was mad, and I definitely was angry with God, but it was more just like a deep sense of disappointment and loss about something that I had thought it wasn't even a dream. It was just like an expectation. And so not having that was, yeah, a total shock to the system, where then it made me, again, first I was pretty angry, but then I just kept feeling nudged to lean deeper into it and to find more opportunities to understand who I was, to understand how things truly were. And it led deeper into this wakefulness that he talks about, where, now I had an opportunity to not waste my suffering on self-pity,
Mm.
but to do something constructive with it. And so I turned that into just kind of deeper self-awareness and growth. But then it didn't stop there, because I had been in seminary at the time. And so I'm wrestling with all this deep theology and history. And so I probably passed and aced all my classes because I had the greatest example to be wrestling with constantly. And so I was just thrown into that balance, shaking those things out between home and life and theology.
Yeah, what a beautiful and poignant way to embrace that friction in your life. Yeah, let's continue with that thread of grief and self-awareness, how that can lead to transformation. Your friendship with Carl that you recount in the book, who lived and died without religious belief, is one of the most moving parts of your story. What did Carl teach you about grace that your seminary education didn't?
Yeah, so he broke things open in a way that made it personal. So I would say, as you're watching your friend die, You're obviously led to a lot of different emotions. But Carl, again, wasn't going to waste his suffering and found ways to grapple with his deteriorating condition. I mean, he never lost his brilliant mind and cognitive wisdom. And he was just so, he taught these lessons about forgiveness and grace that have just stayed with me ever since. I didn't write about this in the book, but kind of the backstory, a little backstory about why this was so impactful was that just before he learned that he had ALS, he became aware that someone that he trusted was actively betraying him.
Mm.
And then that betrayal continued during his disease. And Carl's friends and family, those who were close to us, we became aware of this too. So when Carl started talking about, I've forgiven them, I'm letting it go and opting to go that route because he was like, this is more important. I don't want to die holding on to resentment and this pain. And he totally leaned into grace, this radical word of grace. And that was really, that stung a lot of his really close friends. All I could see was Jesus Christ. I was just like, that is what Jesus would do. That's the lesson. And Carl got it. This atheist got it and practiced it, and it just blew my mind.
Mm. Yeah. Reminds me of the most memorable stanza in that poem. The poet's alluding me at the moment when kingfishers catch fire, where it says, Christ plays in 10,000 places. And yeah, it often shouldn't surprise me that it can, that like, yeah, that this grace can show up in the most unexpected places. I think.
Yeah, because I mean, in the church, it's this abstract impersonal concept where, we're taught that Jesus died for your sins and laid his life down for his friends. And it's not that those things don't make you think, but they're just not personal to you. You're not witnessing it firsthand. And that juxtaposition is significant. When you feel the sting of someone being betrayed and then are wowed by their decision to forgive, when we're wired to just stick it to them and see revenge and all that. And so that's where there's that big difference between what institutional religion says versus seeing your friend live it and practice it and mean it. Like
Mhm.
genuinely, it's not lip service. He genuinely meant it. And it's like, you're in the blast radius with them and he's just like, hey, just let it go.
Mm.
Just let it go. So I just feel like maybe Jesus was actually thinking about us in the 21st century, but I have came to believe that that might have just been added on after his time to include us. I don't know, but I know Carl and I know Carl's situation, and that was a pretty meaningful takeaway for me.
Yeah. Let's talk more about this grace and forgiveness. You write that I forgave myself for the things I did not do. And, that's a part of many of our liturgical confessions, but it's such a raw confession to make personally. In your experience as a pastor and as a human being, what's the connection between self-forgiveness and spiritual growth?
So quick point of clarification. That was actually something that Carl said in the book, and
Yeah.
it came from this story where, again, before he got the diagnosis with ALS, his son asked him to play with him one day, and he just kind of blew it off. And then he lost motor function. He could no longer kick the ball around with his son ever again. And so, that was, again, this reminder of having to just forgive yourself. That how would you know, and not beat yourself up about it. And obviously we've all said something and felt something about the things that you don't do, the risks that you don't take, not saying the kind word when you could have. We all struggle with that. I think the connection with self-forgiveness and giving yourself grace and spiritual growth, it comes down to what I kind of call like your emotional bandwidth. So when you're grieving or carrying some kind of heavy burden, or you're angry, or you got a conflicted conscience, you have to focus so intently on that but then that's going to interfere with your capacity to grow and to be free. So if you're giving into self-loathing or immersed in that grief world, it's not a bad thing. It's just you can't expect someone who's barely keeping their head above water to have the ability to grow and to experience that kind of expansion. So it's kind of like survival versus spiritual growth. And so I think that's where, again, it truly, for lack of a better way, it is that gift that keeps on giving, right? That self-grace where it creates this freedom for you to move forward rather than just spinning the wheels or moving backwards with these other heavy emotions.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of something that Brother Lawrence says in The Practice of the Presence of God, whether it's about his own steadfastness in the spiritual practice that he puts before him to have the presence of God always, top of mind and heart, or even how he's serving his brothers as a cook, that whenever he falls short, he says something to the effect of, well, God, you know this is how I am. Like, this is me. I think his nickname was like Brother Ass or something. There's some beauty in humanity and relief to recognizing that. And of course, to really fulfill Jesus' injunction to love our neighbor as ourselves, we have to love ourselves. And that includes
Yes.
giving
Yep.
ourselves.
Yeah, Lutherans get a lot of burned out Catholics that come in and, grew up being told, what to think, how to feel. And this isn't all of Catholicism by any means, but, some people have had just really tough experiences where there was a lack of grace. And here it's just like, it's a lot of grace. And so there's a freeing, this lightening of the burden for them where they feel like they can actually embrace who they are and find different ways to grow that they either didn't give themselves permission to or were not given permission to do previously. And so I think that's again something where you're not giving yourself a pass that you're that way and that's it, but forgiving yourself, saying it's okay, I'll do better next time, and then trying to find a way to improve in the future, but not wallowing in how crappy you are as a person or whatever.
Yes, I think that emphasis on liberating grace is one of the jewels of the Lutheran tradition. And also one of my favorite writers who's technically an Episcopal priest, but I feel like he should be an honorary Lutheran, Robert Farrar Capon.
Yep. I've read some of the stuff in seminary for sure.
As a chef and a priest, and between noon and 3 is all about that scandal of grace, as are so many of his works. Well, let's talk more about the life of the church and like your own pastoral experience, because you describe the church as a place where curiosity often goes to die, or at least to take a nap. What might it look like to design communities of faith that actually reward critical thinking instead of resisting it?
So I am a lover of ancient Greek history, and I had a chance to go to Greece on a sabbatical, and it's kind of obviously from the Bible. And I'm just kind of wondering and dreaming if churches can be a place where that like ancient Greek public discourse can find a renaissance and where we can debate religious ideas like they did, like Socrates in the market, talking to anyone who walks by. I guess it could be construed as soapbox preachers near football stadiums, but I'm thinking more of like dialogue that actually takes place rather than just people preaching at passerby, where there's a focus on let's just discuss these ideas and our questions. Let's just name them, put them out there for the sake of learning a little bit more about ourselves and about our neighbors, a way to, yeah, to kind of just bring back this divine conversation instead of and having it be again, not that it can't happen online, but there is something so much more meaningful when you're looking at somebody like you and I are right now, or again, being in person or over a meal, or to maybe make church out of these public spaces outside of the buildings themselves, the sanctuaries themselves. I haven't given up that it can't happen here, in a church facility. But I do think that there's something to be said about getting outside of these walls to where people are already congregating, where their guard isn't up, and to, again, try to encourage that kind of open, loose conversation. Most of my best preaching happens either over a beer or coffee or a meal, like just shooting the breeze with people, listening, looking them in the eye, hearing their story, interjecting mine. And so that's where I feel most rewarded is in those conversations with people of all ages in my confirmation classes and with older people. I just feel like we need more of those kinds of conversations, and that can be a place where critical thinking really shines. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed if someone were to raise their hand and ask a question in the middle of a sermon, but I know a lot of other people will be really uncomfortable with that, right?
It's so interesting. I spent a dozen years of my life involved in this house church movement where the attempt was to recover something of the spirit and practice of the first century church. And, it's debatable what the first century church looked like, but you do have these odd passages in the New Testament that say, when you all gather together, each one of you brings a teaching, a prophecy, an exhortation, or you each bring a psalm, a hymn, a spiritual song. And so we held these open and participatory gatherings and kind of asked the question of like, when did church become a monologue rather than a
Yeah.
dialogue? But practicing the priesthood of all believers is something that, I remember one college buddy told me at the time when we were holding these kinds of gatherings on campus, he's like, look, we live in an era of specialization. Yes, I have my own personal relationship with God, but I want to pay a guy to study all of that stuff and bring me something to feed me every week. Like I don't actually have the wherewithal to, continuously be bringing something. And I was like, all right, that's honest.
Yeah. And I think we have to be open to exploring venues that are away from the worship mentality that is kind of prevalent in our churches, where pastors maybe can be more like curators of information and facilitating discussion versus these leaders speaking at you. I think skeptics like me largely stay away from attending church because worship communicates this certainty about God. And it's kind of asking of the participant to make these assertions that God is this way and that this is the action that you do towards that belief. And that's where, again, the discourse gets lost. I mean, I've done experimental things in my sermons and try to get more interaction. But again, the way that it's set up and what the expectations of most churchgoers today are, it's tough to do that on a consistent basis. Now, there are outliers, there are mission starts and startups that have done more entrepreneurial and visionary and innovative things, but again, those are not the norm. It gets tricky to experiment constantly in that thing, but that's where I feel like I'm trying to get more of these critical thinkers to feel welcome, to feel like, hey, what you think matters, even if it's not the status quo, the conventional held beliefs. And again, that doubling down that it's about, you developing personally, spiritually, and me doing the same thing. And I can't do that when I'm only with people who are just like, it's this way and not this way, that either or thinking.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think even the very structure of many of our church sanctuaries where everyone's facing the minister and or the altar kind of precludes that more free-flowing exchange of ideas or information, and yeah, it reminds me of, like, kind of what you're talking about. There's, like, fresh expressions in some mainline churches, also the dinner church movement, where folks are attempting to restructure at least how some gatherings happen, where that sort of more
Yeah,
interactivity.
that gives me a lot of hope, man. I love when people are taking risks to just break out and do something different. And again, not tying themselves down to it. We're going to try this for a time, see what happens. I think that's a great way of going about it. It's not that it doesn't happen. I just think most of our conventional minded churches have a ways to go in being open minded to those kinds of expressions.
Yeah, absolutely. But for many listeners who maybe have stepped away entirely from institutional religion, but they still feel haunted by the sacred, what parts of the Christian tradition do you find still worth hanging on to, even if one no longer believes in the traditional sense?
Yeah, I still highly value Jesus and the words that are found in scripture about him. I have my doubts about the veracity of some of them, but I still think there's enough there of his story that can draw you in a really meaningful way, to not treat it as something that necessarily happened literally, factually, but that it happens, that there are these patterns that are evoked through his story, the cross and suffering for things that you believe in, for things that you're passionate about, for your truth, and then experiencing resurrection, transformation, where or rebirth, where something really, something really difficult has happened, and then you've come out of that situation seeing things in a new light. So I think those kinds of themes will always have play, will always be worth looking at and looking at differently each time you go into them. Those are still really meaningful to me, even though I've taken a completely, maybe not unconventional way of thinking about them, I guess. So, I mean, everything. That's why I'm still doing this, is that I haven't left because I still feel like there's a way to wrestle with it that isn't just that like dogmatic, it has to be this way or else. Radical grace, as I've mentioned, being inclusive, taking risks, repentance, I call for stop doing the thing that's not life giving, change that and go in a different direction. That's all throughout the scriptures. Again, speaking truth to oppression and looking out for the downtrodden and the outcast. These are things that matter. And you don't have to believe exactly the way that maybe you grew up believing, and you don't have to dismiss it altogether either. I think there is a middle ground. There is a third way to hold on to it, to again bring that out of yourself and out of other people around you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so curious, Keith, given that sounds like relatively early on, you gave yourself radical permission to question every belief. Not that you would make this prescriptive for anyone else, but are there any beliefs that once you gave yourself full permission to doubt them, that you actually kind of came back around? You're like, actually, I personally buy into this. Like, I actually really into this particular doctrine
Oh,
or belief.
I'll I haven't come around completely on it, but recently I've been reading Autobiography of a Yogi, and this topic of the virgin birth came up. And that was one where I was just like, absolutely not. That doesn't happen. End of story. I became very dogmatically against it. And he talks about it, and I won't play spoiler, but it does bring up this idea of and bringing back again around to kind of Joseph Campbell's take, which is when we talk about virgin birth, it's more about the spiritual meaning rather than avoiding, having anyone of importance have had sexual intercourse or whatever. Like it's more about just that spiritual, mystical purity, if you will. And so I've now, and then my scientific brain also knows that there are virgin births in the in the animal world, that is something that's possible. You can Google it if you don't believe me. And so I have upgraded it. I have upgraded the virgin birth from absolutely not to I don't know. So we're back in the I don't know land. I that's the skeptical part of me has a really hard time with it. But again, you're always evolving and growing and learning and pulling from different fields to just I don't know, to be like, maybe,
Absolutely. You've heard it here first, folks. Keith Long has upgraded this
Oh,
bird to an maybe. I hope you don't get kicked out of the Dogmatic Skeptics Club.
I know, I know. I'm like, seriously though, I'm like, I don't want to, but then it's like, oh man, it's just, it's because, it's so easy to just say that there's dogmatism in religion when it's just as prevalent in many other fields, especially science. And so
There
I
is.
just think there's something really good about always testing. I'll probably end up back in absolutely not in no time at all. But it's just that like I have to be true to my word to staying curious and open minded and not just ruling things out because I don't like them.
For those unfamiliar, Yogananda was a Hindu holy man who came to the West and really had a profound appreciation for Jesus and has this like really beautiful inner spiritual synthesis using Kriya Yoga, but also appreciating Christian mysticism and love. And yeah, Autobiography of a Yogi is definitely a classic. Highly recommend. And what you're sharing reminds me of something that Phyllis Tickle says. You know, she was an Episcopal journalist and laywoman, and it might have been she recounted it verbally many times when she spoke in emerging church contexts, but it might have also be in the Great Emergence book. And she talks about the differences between modernity and postmodernity in that exacting modernist scholarship kind of weighed the probability of the virgin birth and dismissed it as out of hand. And that one day she was speaking about this, and there was this young girl, I think like 9 years old or something, in the audience that said to her, "But the virgin birth is such a beautiful story. Like I love it." And that, yeah, there can be room for this mystery and this wonder that goes beyond the sort of either or thinking of a binary mind. But
Yeah,
yeah,
and it really stems from still this core belief that Jesus was legitimately awesome and still is, and that when you do kind of admire and truly like love this person, again, it goes back to like, am I thinking too small here? Am I relegating myself only to this small understanding? Should I be more open to the fact that, man, maybe Jesus really was that awesome, you know? Again, I stand by what I wrote. I don't recant anything from Doubting Faithfully, but I have been, in more of these mystical rabbit holes lately where it is kind of starting to work on me a little bit to reopen to this universe being weird as hell and not being able to escape the mystery that is in our midst. And so I just, yeah, continue to try to just be open to those stirrings, even though I can't not be a skeptic either.
yeah, I hear you. As an alumni of the Pentecostal and charismatic movements, where 90% of that stuff I witnessed to be wishful thinking or outright fraud, there's still a 10% I can't personally account for. And as I have built friendships with people in other faith traditions, the world is a very strange place. And while we do have confirmation bias and other sorts of things, there are certain things that I'm like, man, are sort of, I don't want to like try to misappropriate scientific language, but there does seem to be like kind of a quantum entanglement of our consciousness and ways that we relate that seem to be in more than reductively materialist ways, or at least ways that we don't yet understand how the material world works, maybe.
Oh,
And
yes.
we were such
I mean, the consciousness studies are mind blowing. And regardless of, I mean, the scientific inquiry is legit, but there is a growing number of evidence and instances out there where it's like they don't know. And I love that. I love that people don't know and are willing to admit they don't know. And I think that gives us hope to say, hey, that unknowing is a beautiful thing. And I love knowing. I love knowing, but unknowing is where we grow.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, absolutely. Got to give a shout out to occult journalist Mitch Horowitz, as well as new religious movement scholar Jeffrey Kripal. Both of them do really interesting work, kind of summarizing various research into what we might sometimes call paranormal phenomenon. And Rupert Sheldrake, too, like ways of trying
Oh, yeah.
to empirically test weird phenomena. Well, as we bring this in for a landing, let's stay on this theme of like mystical experience, because you mention a kind of supernatural encounter in Gettysburg in your book that defies easy explanation. In a book that's steeped in skepticism, so how do you integrate mystical experience without making it dogmatic on the one hand, but without dismissing it either?
I think it just goes back to just being honest that it exists, that the subject exists, even if you don't believe that the thing exists, that through education, here it is. This is what some people say who encountered it in this way. And here's what people say who don't believe that it exists, but just bringing it into the open instead of, shushing it and keeping it away, thinking that, well, if I bring it up, that people are going to be swayed or led down the wrong direction. To just be like, can we just be adults here and name these things and then be very clear to not take a position, at least from the pulpit. I mean, that's the thing with doubting faithfully, is that I've never like preached doubting faithfully from the pulpit. Like, I wrote it, I self-published it, didn't promote it. It just kind of was there. People found out about from word of mouth. We've had conversations, but I think it's important to just, here's what I've learned, or here's what happened to me. What do you think? Or what's happened to you? And it's just more just treating it from an educational standpoint. And I know you can be dogmatic in an educational standpoint, but you can, again, try to be more neutral in like, this is what the thing is. Let's look at it. And then you can decide and discern what, if anything, you're going to do with it. And it, again, treat people that they have a brain and that they have choice in the matter, in how to integrate it or not. And that's really been the only thing that's ever happened, other than some kind of strange dreams that I've had. But I just enjoy, again, let's just open it up and now let's dig in and see what we've got here. And a lot of people here frequently refer to me as a teaching pastor. I just like to give you the historical context and give you some scientific things to ponder in relation to what I know about the text. And I just find that to be life-giving. And from what I've heard from people, they find it life-giving too. And that's what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we want people to read about the experience in the book, can you give us just a little bit of what that experience was for people who are listening?
So Gettysburg, many people know, is one of the most haunted places in the world. And I was at a religious conference on church leadership, and we were staying on the seminary campus, which is in Gettysburg, which is kind of known to be the place where the battle first broke out. And I had done that week, I'd gone on a couple of ghost tours just to kind of hear the stories from the locals. And then when I went back to my room one night, woke up in the middle of the night to this strong smell of pipe tobacco. And I knew what pipe tobacco was because my grandfather used to smoke tobacco from a pipe. And so I had woken up and I'm like, why am I smelling pipe tobacco? Like, it feels like it's in my room right now. And then I just got really afraid. Oh my goodness, is there like a soldier in my room, messing with me? And so I played a possum and I was just like super still and kept my eyes closed because I really didn't want to see anything. And so I just was just bad, like just smelling this thing. And then I either fell back asleep or it went away. I don't really remember. And I was, sharing the story with people the next day and they're like, oh, that's nothing. And then, they've shared some stories that have happened to them. And I was just like, grateful that it was just pipe tobacco. It's a good word.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, so as we're wrapping up here, one of the major themes of my life as well as my work is praxis, is a spiritual practice. And so if you could create a spiritual practice out of doubting faithfully, what would it look like? What habits or postures could listeners experiment with to move from intellectual disillusionment to a kind of sacred unknowing?
I would say for habits and postures, trying to, if you're like me, with this material, that intellectual, you're like constantly in your head and you're just working through things in your head. So I would encourage to get out of your head if you can through, activity, either like a conversation with somebody or trying to just shake loose some of these things that are just giving you constant chatter within, and maybe do something that scares you or do something you never would do. And maybe you're one of those people that you don't believe in ghosts. Well, go on a ghost tour and just listen and observe. Do just things off the beaten path that you normally wouldn't do. For me, it was like doing things physical, like a ropes course or rock climbing, ways that you can, again, see how you are interacting with the thing and then go back into your head and kind of process it and work it out. But I think just only being in your head and not ever really interacting, it just eventually can drive you insane. Like, it literally can drive you crazy to just constantly be working it through. World travel's a great way to get yourself out of your comfort zone. to develop more of those experiences. So those are some things that I've done silent retreats. That's also really good, meditation. But again, if it's more just like that intellectualization, that might not be great if you're constantly going to be tempted to just sit and think. I love thinking. I do it all the time, but I like to mix it up. I think for me, though, the spiritual practice is the wandering. And I'm really intentional with that word wander because it's the idea that you have a home or you have a place of rootedness that you're then just kind of going out and you're checking out some different things for a set amount of time. And then you're going back to that place of rootedness to kind of check in with others, to share what you've learned, to kind of hear what other people and their wandering is doing, rather than just like, I'm deconstructing and getting the hell out of here. And again, maybe for self-preservation's sake, that's what you need to do. But for the spiritual practice part of it, it's that sense of still finding something that keeps you grounded. And so, the Greeks would do this. They would still have their religious rituals so that people still had that identity. Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey. You go out, you learn the thing, but you always return back to share what you've learned. So I think that's, for me, what this life has become for me is I'm just always wandering and, checking out different things, but then still having a groundedness. Even if it's something that I wrestle with, it's still that identity. So I don't feel so isolated and scattered in the wind in 1,000 different directions. Because ultimately, I'm trying to rebuild, not just deconstruct. Ultimately, why I published this, why I took that risk is so that maybe I can create a way to do this for skeptics. Maybe I can create something that I don't really see happening. Having that in mind lets me experiment with the wandering rather than just kicking the barn down, which again is pretty fun. But I don't think it really leads to a whole lot of personal growth. It just makes you angry. And I just think there's a lot of joy to be had in doing this.
I agree, Keith, and there's so much wisdom in what you just said. I think for a lot of folks who come from my background of conservative evangelicalism, we're willing to deconstruct almost everything that we heard and learned in conservative evangelicalism, except for the assertion that conservative evangelicalism is the only legitimate form of Christianity. I often find that that is the one undeconstructed assumption. And so folks leap immediately from conservative evangelicalism ain't it to, guess I must be an atheist now, and a pretty cynical one at that, because they still uncritically embrace the belief that more progressive forms of Christianity, or even just older, more mainline forms of Christianity that have more epistemic humility, aren't real believers, aren't legitimate expressions of faith. And what I love about your life and your work is you're saying, no, you actually can find community that will encourage you, to invoke the words that old hymn, just as I am without one plea. And, in my life, that's made all the difference to still have flesh and blood community. It's very countercultural in this day and age, especially with the demands capitalism places on us to associate in meat space and 3D space is such a difficult thing for a lot of folks, even economically. So I don't take that for granted. I would encourage anyone listening to, look up in your, do a Google search, see if there's an ECLA church, a United Church of Christ church, Alliance of Baptists, PCUSA, so many denominations. And of course, they vary by congregation, but there are a lot of people that might very well be local to you that will encourage your entire self, faith, doubt, and all.
Yeah, always open to conversation. You can always hit me up, meet you if you're local, email, that's the kind of thing. Give recommendations. I read a lot, I listen a lot, see a lot of things. Mike is also very well versed in that land. And so I know it can feel isolating sometimes, especially if you're coming from a fundamentalist background. I've heard that. But yeah, I think just naming it, having conversation about it is a great step and an ongoing step to take, where I'm just kind of thinking about this, or what do you think about this?
Yeah, Doubting Faithfully folks, we're going to have a link in the show notes for how you can order this book, also for Keith's website. And Keith, I know that you stay relatively busy as a local minister, but I do believe that you are available for virtually and in person to do presentations for groups. And I feel like you have things that you can offer both for congregations who are wanting to make this shift into greater inclusion of doubt as well as faith. And I think you obviously also have things to say for people who find themselves outside the camp. Do you want to name a couple things that you're available to talk to people about?
Presentation that I've led before with church groups is kind of geared towards, the baby boomer generation. So the title of that is Why Your Grandkids Aren't Going to Church, and kind of helping to facilitate conversation and helping these adults and grandparents to have dialogue with their grandkids, to understand where they're coming from a little bit more, especially in regards to doubt and scientific beliefs and just kind of their experience of institutional church today. So that's something that I love doing with church groups. I've done some topics on tap, conversations about anything from, the demonic to Christian white nationalism to just, again, anything and everything is fair game. So I've kind of coined, I should really make business cards, but I call it pastor on demand. And so, hit me up if you'd like me to come out for just a small group conversation with people. I've also done non-religious weddings and funerals, trying to find ways to cross over, I guess, if you will, into places that, things that are still sacred that you don't necessarily want religious language for. And so those are things that I'm well versed in doing. And yeah, like I said, just conversation and being on podcasts like this are ways that I enjoy talking about doubt and getting people to rethink what they believe and why.
Beautiful. And we will have Keith's website in the show notes. But if you're listening, it is authorkeithlong.com. You reach out to Keith that way. Again, highly encourage you to grab your own copy of Doubting Faithfully. Keith, thanks so much for talking with me today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Mike. Love your work. And yeah, stay curious out there. Thank you.